Right. The house in the Cerulean Sea, not by the Cerulean Sea or on the Cerulean Sea, but in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. The house wasn't actually in the sea, spoilers. I actually read this book back in 2022, so last year. It stayed with me, that's for certain. When I read it, it was kind of almost the height of its hype. Everyone had read it. There were very strong opinions about it. Most people absolutely adored it. And I seem to be unusual in that while I enjoyed it, it was sort of a 3-star read for me. I didn't love it, I didn't hate it. Most people seem to be very extreme about it. 5-star, it changed their life, the best book they ever read. Or 1-star, they hated it for a whole heap of reasons, many of which I haven't followed. But anyway, I won't recap the story too much because I feel that around about 2023 everyone knows this story because it's been so very hyped and followed. And I'm not saying it doesn't deserve its hype. It's a very, very good, magical, if you'll pardon the pun, vivid, bright book. And it's got a lot of feel-good elements to it. Magical realism is definitely in fashion. I listened to the narration by Macmillan audiobook. My Goodreads review isn't telling me who did the narration for that, but if I can figure it out, I'll post it underneath in the comments. And the narration. Now, I know some people strongly feel that one shouldn't even mention the narration when one's talking about a book review. I disagree. That book was published. It was published with its narration. And if you're going to think about listening to the book, I'm going to mention that I don't think that this narration was the story living its best life. I really don't. I can usually separate the narration to some extent. A few times I've disliked it enough that I've gone back and read the book, but I think it's now literally impossible for me to imagine this book in any way except with the narration. And I have a sneaking feeling that I would have enjoyed it a lot more if I'd actually read it than with the narration. So the narration used a squeaky, weird, so weird voice for most females. In the case of Zoe, who's an adult, it was squeaky snobbish. Talia, who's a child gnome, it's managed to be both squeaky and gruff. How do you do that? He did it. It was annoying, but he did it, and he did it a lot because Talia is a fairly central character, so she was there a lot. Now, aside from the fact that they squeaked, all of them, most of the females in this book do not treat Linus well. They treat him pretty poorly. And so that, between the squeaking and the abusing Linus, none of the females were actually very relatable in my opinion. I think of myself as an equalist. I don't like men abusing women, but women abusing men is equally bad. And I think the way they treated him was poor. Maybe it was making a point. I don't know. This is the only book by this author I've read, and I'm hesitating before I read any other ones. Okay, so when he wasn't squeaking, the narrator had a strange, breathy voice for some characters and a pompous voice for others. And more than once, he got confused about who he was reading, so he'd used the wrong voice. So, yeah, his natural background reading voice was very good. I just wish he'd used that throughout instead of trying to do children's book at bedtime voice sort of weird thing that he was doing. Now, the one thing that really bothered me throughout this book and bothered me after I finished it and has continued bothering me is that I could never really get a handle on who the target audience for this was meant to be. And it's bothered me that it bothered me while I was thinking about it. I don't really mind who a book was written for. I read adult books, I read kids' books, I read young adult books, I even read those really, really young children's books because some of them have fantastic artwork and often pretty good concepts. So I don't actually mind, but this book couldn't seem to settle on its target audience, and that bothered me, which annoyed me. So yes, anyway, who was the target audience? Does anyone actually know? You'd think it was children according to the voices that the narrator did, and there's a lot of children in it, but the theme is overall adult. The magic realism and the secondary characters could suit any reader group, but the narration seemed definitely aimed at 10 to 15-year-olds. The notions of extremely upper management and Linus's working life seems a mock-up for adults, but they're told so basically, so essentially, that they would suit a child audience. I really don't know, and I never did know, and I have to admit that I found it annoying. One thing especially that I found annoying about that is Linus. Linus as a character works as an adult if he has maybe Asperger's syndrome or something like that. And maybe that was the goal. Maybe the adult was meant to be a class of his own who often is discriminated against by society, as well as the magical children being discriminated against by society. If that's what the author was going for, then he did it well, and it was subtle, but it was so subtle that I was never sure that that was what was actually happening, because I couldn't tell if it was written for children. Linus came across as a child's idea of what an adult was, rather than an adult experiencing another adult. And for me, that was bothersome all the way through. Now, there were many things I loved about this book. I loved the island, I loved the orphanage, I loved the whole world building methodology. I thought was really good, the way the world was built up and the magical children incorporated into it, and Linus's job as it was described. I thought that all of that was excellent. I loved the notion of the department in charge of magical youth, and I thought that Linus's caseworking was nicely presented. It didn't start with this particular orphanage, it started with a different one. I thought that was good. There were a lot of things that built up Linus as a real character, but he never quite made it as an adult character. The description of the daily grind of working for a dehumanizing corporation, also marvelously done. I think that describes an adult feeling of the unenjoyable workplace, personally, and the bullying, but perhaps basically enough that hypothetical 10-year-old could also enjoy it. Again, who was this for? Now, okay, the magic realism of the story makes a perfect framework for presenting how we as humans have often failed to protect the vulnerable. So let's start with Linus, because honestly, the underlying themes of inclusivity and non-judgmental of other people who aren't like ourselves, I think they start with Linus here. I haven't heard anyone else that got this impression, but to me, I thought so. He's conscientious and he's earnest, but he's lacking in social skills. He has no sense of humour, nor ability to comprehend humour, really. The level of bullying in his workplace is endemic, vicious, and has obviously done very bad things to him psychologically. It's presented in a fantastical fashion, but it's all too reminiscent of how some large companies do actually treat their workers, so it was very well done. But there's small things in there that are magical realism and not actual realism, like nothing being allowed to have on your desk at work. There's strange things, and you have to write that off as magical realism. Okay, I can do that. Okay. Right, now, when I was reading this, I didn't know a lot about it. Like I said, I hadn't read anything by this author before, and all I'd read is that everyone absolutely gushing about how much they loved this book. I didn't know too much about the details. So when I was first reading about the Marsyas Island Orphanage, I got the strongest feeling that this was actually crafted from stories on reality. As an Australian, I felt that this worked well as a critique of the stolen generations. Now, after I'd finished reading it, I found out that the author was actually inspired by similar types of imperialism and maltreatment of First Nations people in Canada. And I also found out that many readers loathed that he was doing this. I actually think it was a good concept. These magical, real magical children aren't First Nations, and they aren't Australian Aboriginals, they aren't children stolen from their parents. It's a novel. I don't see why people got upset, and I do think that anything that shines light on those sort of practices so that it stays in people's minds and doesn't happen again, I think that's a great thing. So, yes, I thought the magical creatures of the island and of the world were interesting, and there was a plethora of them. There were so many. It was never really explained how they were there, but that was actually okay in terms of the underwriting of details. Yeah, I liked it. So the individual characters of the children on Marsyas and the evolution of all the characters within the story was well done. I unfortunately didn't like many of the children on Marsyas. I found Talia vastly annoying, and the author obviously adored her because we never ever got away from her. But anyway, you either like her or you don't like her. Now, the things that I did not like were fewer but repeated themselves without cease. Like the way we were told repeatedly preached to in the text about how everyone is an individual and perfect just as they are, etc., etc., etc. I don't need to hear that every page, TJ Klune. I just really don't. If I'd been reading it, I'd been able to skim through it, but as a listener, I had to bear with it every single time, and honestly, it should have been edited, about 20% of it should have been edited out. Also, the repeated impassioned monologues about how children deserve to be treated well. I mean, I think I strained an eyeball rolling it. I'm not saying that they're wrong. Sure, children deserve to be treated well. They deserve to be treated well no matter what their backgrounds, obviously. But a sense of proportion in preaching this would have been better and made it more readable. I totally lost track of how often "they are children" was repeated in the text. It's like, oh my god, not again, please. Oh. Edit it out. Tone it down. Anyway, so the world building that could be excusable in a kid's book like really young kids where just so stories are still workable, but the lack of background world building for an adult was supremely noticeable. It really was. Oh yes, and as a perfect example of that is the child Lucy, aka Lucifer, son of the devil, mother unknown, WTF. I mean, how does any of that make sense? I get that it's meant to be quirky and cute and something or other, but it just doesn't make sense. And it never does. No explanation is ever given. No... How do you not know who someone's mother is? How do you know that it is the devil's his father? How? Just how? And to be honest, right up to the end, I was half suspecting that we'd find out that Lucy was actually Arthur's son, but no, that level of explanation never happened. No explanation ever did. Linus faints when he reads Lucy's file, and that just left me confused. He doesn't faint normally. This was the only fainting. Why would he be that upset? He's been dealing with all sorts of magical children for years. Why is the devil actually real in this world? Nothing else from normal world mythology seems to be. Oh well, whatever. So the net reason normal people hate magical people is never really explained, I suppose, in terms of context of just trying to say everyone is different. That makes sense. I thought it was a bit noticeable, especially as an adult reading the book. How they came to be magical was never explained. The parameters of how magical creatures exist was never explained. What happens to these children when they leave the orphanages and are no longer magical children? Presumably, some of them other than Zoe have become magical adults. What happens to them? Never explained. Never touched on. I thought that was a bit too mystifying. So, yes. I liked Linus's character and I liked Arthur's character. I could not find the slow, shy blossoming of their relationship as charming as I wanted to find it. I really wanted to find it charming, but instead it seemed more often than not awkward, and it often seemed very contrived. I suspect that had I been reading it, instead of having to listen to it filtered through those strange, breathy, whiny vocals, I might have liked it better, because it's hard to like the whiny vocals that are given Linus. Now, I really did respect one thing this book did. I really respected the way that Linus's sexuality was an understated part of the plot. And I've always thought that having an individual's sexuality being an integral part of the plot rather than being the actual plot makes it more impactful. And since inclusivity is a theme throughout the book, I think that was a good way of doing it. I've read a lot of books that are basically about a person's sexuality. I think normalizing it into a story is probably going to have better social effect in the long run. My opinion, possibly unpopular. Now, about that romance, which gives a happy ending, which I was happy about, the target age of the audience with the romantic attachment seemed to not quite make it on any grade. Doesn't quite hit the mark for adults, not being enough, and perhaps being subtler than one might expect from a kid's book. I'm not sure that a kid would have got the subtlety of that, but it didn't really feel like it satisfied on any of these levels. Now, there was a lot that was charming about this book. I remained uncharmed, and I remember it with mixed feelings. I've always thought of myself as someone who really, really loves magical realism, and a lot of the earlier magical realism that I was reading, like the Golem and the Djinn, for example, I adored. This one I didn't adore, and it seems to be part of a vanguard of subculture writing of magical realism that doesn't seem to quite make the grade for me. I'm largely reviewing this book because I'm currently reading another magical realism book that seems to be going the same way. So yes, The House in the Cerulean Sea. Spoilers, wasn't actually in the ocean. If you like magical realism, I think you'll like this book. It's certainly worth reading. If you like magical realism, you've probably already read this book. If so, tell me how wrong I am about it by all means. Go for it.